Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. In this video, I shall carry on my series about A-level history, looking at the history of the Soviet Union and looking at the Second World War as it relates to the Soviet Union, which was, of course, the main theatre of operations for the Second World War. So the German High Command was considering when to launch Operation Barbarossa. That was his invasion of the Soviet Union. In 1941, the Third Reich was eager to conclude peace with the British Empire. However, it didn't happen. The British were not fighting very effectively, nor were their dominions or colonies. The Third Reich was fighting the empire on the seas and oceans in North Africa, to some extent in the skies. But these were not the main front of the war. In a sense, there was no main front, but the main front was about to be the Soviet Union. The Third Reich did not desire to fight against the UK. For them, it was an unfortunate corollary of invading Poland. They'd miscalculated. They assumed that the British were entirely cynical, that the British couldn't even rely on their own word and were not going to defend Poland. It seemed to make no sense. There was no British national interest in that. That's what Berlin concluded. The Third Reich's archenemy was the Soviet Union, even though they'd formed this 10-year non-aggression pact in 1939 and been doing plenty of commerce until 1941. So the Third Reich had attempted to make peace with the British Empire, believing then that would allow them to send all their forces to the east in order to crush the Soviet Union. So as the British did not appear to be amenable to negotiation, Hitler concluded that he must defeat the Soviet Union, and that would bring the British to their knees, indeed to their senses, as the Nazi would see it. Because the British were banking on the Soviet Union might help us, might change sides, and that was really the only ray of hope for the United Kingdom and her dominions, because it was impossible to see how they could possibly best the Third Reich, because Germany was the major industrial power in Europe besides the Soviet Union and controlled so many other industrialized countries such as, say, France, the Netherlands. There were neutral countries, such as, like, say, Sweden, which were trading with Germany, or else these fairly industrialized countries were on Germany's side, for instance, Italy. So if the Soviet Union was comprehensively defeated, then the United Kingdom would be compelled to sue for peace. British intelligence, particularly in Switzerland, the loosely spy ring, picked up tidbits about this proposed German invasion of the USSR, and there were increasingly blatant German reconnaissance flights over Soviet territory, so the Germans were less and less discreet. A Russian phrasebook was published for German army officers, and it had sentences such as, put your hands up, surrender, point out the communists and Jews amongst you. A German functionary who was sympathetic to communism and therefore the Soviet Union showed this to a Soviet official in Germany. It was reported back to Moscow. Some German communists formed a spy ring, the Rote Kapelle, and as the Soviet Union was the only communist state on earth, they thought we've got to help the big daddy of communism, and the only chance of communism winning the world over and Germany becoming a communist state is if the Soviet Union wins this war and the Third Reich is smashed. However, Moscow simply dismissed out of hand of all this evidence. He refused to believe the very convincing evidence. He was confident that the Third Reich would abide by the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. He thought that this claim that Germany was about to attack the Soviet Union was for the birds. These were desperate words from desperate men. The British were on the verge of defeat, and their only chance of staving that off is if they could get the Germans and the Soviets to fight against each other, just as the British had calculated in 1916, or indeed in 1812. They had to get the two major continental powers to batter each other senseless. That's the only way the Brits could survive. So the United Kingdom was close to vanquishment, and she was playing her last card. Stalin, of course, was very mindful of the British intervention against the Reds in the Russian Civil War, not 20 years earlier. Churchill was a virulent anti-communist. Comrade Stalin believed that the UK was perfidious Albion, and that the British were egging on the Third Reich to attack him prior to 1939. So British policy was no different now, only more urgent, but Hitler was going to honour his word. Well, it was a grave misjudgment on the part of Comrade Stalin. The German military had been due to attack the Soviet Union in May 1941. However, then King Peter of Yugoslavia came of age. As he was 18, the country was no longer run by his uncle, Prince Paul, and King Peter changed tack. Prince Paul had pursued a pro-German line. King Peter declared himself to be pro-British. He'd actually seized power. It was shortly before he turned 18. It was a palace coup. So the German military could not attack the USSR with a large allied country to their rear. Therefore, the Wehrmacht invaded Yugoslavia to subdue it. Yugoslavia no longer exists. It's a country that was based around Serbia, include Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Slovenia, Kosovo, Montenegro. Have I left any out? Macedonia, that's it. Anyway, so it took the Germans 6 weeks to defeat Yugoslavia, garrison it with some of their troops and Italians, leaving only a few men behind and getting back into position on the border of the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia is broken up. The Third Reich played on the ethnic and religious divisions of the country to make the occupation easier for themselves. And they said that Yugoslavia was an artificial country. To some extent that was true. Hadn't existed till 1918, even as a concept. The Slovenes had an affinity for the Germans. They were on the border of Austria, so they were treated decently. The Croats were given an independent state under their leader, who was a fascist, Ante Pavelic. They were a Catholic country. Bosnia-Herzegovina was a Muslim state. Some of those people were of Turkish descent, so a Muslim state was created, and some Bosniaks, that's Bosnian Muslims, joined the SS division Das Reich. The Slovenes tended to cooperate with the Axis owing to their affinity for Austria and therefore Germany, their shared Catholicism with the Austrians. The Serbs were considered an enemy race to be Slavic. Now, of course, there's little or no ethnic difference between these people. It's part of the Nazi absurd racist obsession. They were mostly Orthodox Christians, the Serbs. The Germans suspect the Serbs of having fellow feeling for the Russians. To a large extent, that's true, but not many Serbs were communists. There were two Yugoslav resistance movements. One is headed by Drava Mihailovic, who was a royalist. They called themselves Chetniks. To some extent, they were Serb nationalists. They wanted to preserve Yugoslavia after the war, which they viewed as being a greater Serbia, with some logic to their view. There was also a communist resistance movement headed by Josip Broz, known as Tito, for his abrasive manner of addressing people. He was half Slovene, half Croat. He'd spent some time in the Soviet Union, having been a soldier in the Austro-Hungarian army in the First World War, a prisoner of war in Russia, where he'd been exposed to communist Nostra, and he'd lived there being a Comintern agent, dobbing in people for supposedly being Trotskyites in the 20s and 30s just to save his neck. But anyway, then he led a very effective partisan movement in Yugoslavia during the Second World War. The Jews of Yugoslavia were viciously treated by the Axis forces, and they were murdered in large numbers. Many Jewish people therefore joined the partisans. A lot of Serbian civilians were also murdered by Axis forces. So if there was an attack and an Italian or a German soldier was killed, then civilians in the area would be shot dead by the Axis forces. Now, I don't want to be pointing the finger at anyone. No nationality is all bad, no nationality is all good. Guilt is individual, not suggesting all Axis troops did this, nor indeed am I saying that all Slovenes collaborated with the Axis, or even most did. Rather depends what you consider collaboration. Carrying on in your ordinary job, what if it's got nothing to do with the war? What if you're selling food to the German army? You can't really, not do. Does that count as collaboration? So people did what they needed to survive. Some people tried to prosper, persuade themselves that it was ethical what they were doing. And people are on a side in the war generally because of their circumstances. They're born in this group or that group, not because they're particularly good or bad. Anyway, going on to the invasion of the Third Reich. I think I'll leave that one. Sorry, the Third Reich's invasion of the Soviet Union.